Welcome to CoCreate, the future of Fayetteville. I'm Christina Williams with Circles NWA, and today we're talking about one of the most pressing issues in our community, housing. It's been officially declared in Fayetteville that we're in a housing crisis, and that probably doesn't come as a surprise to anyone. For many families, housing is the single biggest expense each month. And for the past few years, we've seen a huge influx of people moving into the area, home sale prices skyrocketing, and rent costs soaring. In 2024, the Fayetteville City Council declared a housing crisis, and they formed a housing crisis task force. And so over the last year, the group has been listening to residents and analyzing data and learning from experts, and their work produced a list of recommendations, really concrete steps that the city could begin to take to address housing affordability, stability, and access. But before we go any further, I want to introduce my colleagues, two people that have been deeply involved in this work. First, we have Anna Hurley, who's the Director of Advocacy at Circles NWA, and Marley Stark, the City of Fayetteville's Economic Vitality Manager. Welcome.
Hi.
Hi.
Excited to do this.
Yeah. So together we've been working really hard to get ready for an event called CoCreate, and this is a model that our organization has developed to generate truly community-driven solutions. So ideas that are coming from people who are acutely experiencing the housing crisis in Fayetteville. So in this episode, we're going to walk through 3 housing focuses that our CoCreate event is going to focus on. So stabilizing renters, creatively using spaces that already exist for housing, and expanding access to homeownership. But before we dive into those focus areas, Marley, you're actually the one that approached our organization with this idea to partner through a grant called the Southern Cities Economic Initiative. Can you explain what that initiative is and why it's so important for the city of Fayetteville?
Absolutely. So in 2025, the city of Fayetteville was awarded a planning grant through that initiative. So this is a program led by the National League of Cities, and they also have some other partners like the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta. So really the goal here is to help cities think differently about economic mobility and resilience, and specifically how they can be thinking about those topics within local policies and programs. So as part of that, we've launched the Fayetteville Futures program, which is really about integrating, different participatory approaches into our planning and policy work. So making sure that residents aren't just impacted by policy, but also have a real voice in shaping it. We know housing is front of mind for most people, so we really wanted that to be our first priority with this program, and we needed a partner who already had trust and deep connections in the community. So that's why we came to Circles.
Yeah, it was really great when you guys approached us. And before we get too far into this, I want to give a short about with Circles, what this is for those who are not familiar. So Circles is a poverty reduction initiative that works with low-income individuals and families to help them pursue upward mobility from poverty. Circles is unique. We flipped the traditional mentorship model on its head to center the leadership of those who are experiencing poverty. So we call our participants circle leaders. You may hear us reference that term today when we're talking. So our participants are circle leaders, and that's not just a name that we give them. We really are helping them grow as leaders in their own life, leaders in our program, but also we believe they're some of the leaders that our community really needs if we want to find real solutions to some of the biggest problems we're facing. And many of our circle leaders fit into the ALICE population. So for those who are not familiar with that, it stands for Asset Limited, Income Constrained, Employed. It's a population that's working but still is struggling to afford basic necessities. And so that's a lot of what we're going to be talking about in this CoCreate. And our circle leaders are matched with 2 or 3 volunteer allies who commit to walking alongside them over the course of 18 months as they're pursuing their goals for upward mobility. So we've been really thankful for the people that have participated in our program thus far. And I think that's really where this idea of CoCreate comes in. At Circles, we've been working on this model with our circle leaders and allies and the various cohorts that we've started to really come up with these community-driven solutions with our allies learning from our circle leaders of what they're experiencing in the community.
Yeah, it's really exciting. And I think what makes CoCreate the initiative so exciting is that it's not only city officials, developers, policy experts deciding what should happen, but we're actually getting the community and residents in the driver's seat. These are people who are ALICE. There are people who are cost burden renters who are trying to buy their first home, and they know firsthand and are experiencing the gaps, where the gaps are, what kind of solutions would actually work. So hearing from them, being able to, again, flip that traditional model, center their voices, where city leaders, nonprofits, and others are in the room too, but the starting point is really with this lived experience.
Yeah, and for us at Circles, it's not just this theory that we have about community-driven solutions. At Circles, we've actually tried this model out in the area of transportation. So in dialogue, as our Circle leaders and our allies were talking, one of the biggest challenges that came up was around auto financing and Circle leaders experiencing predatory auto lending as a major barrier. And so through this CoCreate process, we brought people in the Circles community together. We had them make sure they really understood what is this challenge that people are facing. And then we had them reimagine and ideate around solutions to the point that we are now in the process of piloting a new fair auto financing program, which is really exciting. And we hope that could have, broad reaching impact in our community. So that's really what we've seen is the power of this approach. And, it's not one that's just trying to raise awareness of the problems, not just a time to say, here's what's going wrong, but it really generates new solutions and helps us move them into action. So housing is the focus of a CoCreate this time, but it's a model that can be used with a lot of other challenges that our cities are facing. But housing is a really big topic, as the three of us are well aware of, and we knew we couldn't take on everything at once. So we had to narrow it in for this particular event. Anna, can you explain the three focus areas that we have chosen to be working with CoCreate and why those were chosen?
Yeah, absolutely. And first, I am so excited to see how this CoCreate model gets applied. I mean, again, we applied to transportation. Now we're going to see it in housing. I look forward to seeing how all the city can come together and continue to co-create. But yes, we are focused on three at this upcoming CoCreate. The first one is stabilizing and supporting renters. We have a huge renter population, and we'll talk about that in a minute. We also are looking at creatively using existing spaces for housing. This is something I'm particularly excited and interested to see what comes out of that bucket. And then we also have expanding access to home ownership. We all know that building wealth goes hand in hand in this country, at least with home ownership. So seeing how we can develop some innovative solutions around that. And all of these things really came directly out of the Housing Crisis Task Force that Christina mentioned earlier. They put together recommendations and as well as the mayor's direction. So they represent the areas where Fayetteville has both the greatest need and we see the greatest opportunity for community-driven solutions. Renters are the backbone of our community and are often the most vulnerable. So we have a lot of underused space in our city that could be unlocked for housing. Exciting to see what comes out of that. And then, as I mentioned, home ownership, traditionally been a pathway to stability and wealth and is continuously increasingly out of reach for families here in Fayetteville. So by focusing on these three buckets, we're giving our community the chance to dig into the biggest challenges and generate ideas that could actually move the needle. Really, really excited to see what comes out.
Yeah, I am too. Okay, so let's start with this first bucket around renters. Renters are really at the heart of our community, especially in Fayetteville. We're talking about families and workers, students, seniors, but they're also the ones that are facing some of the toughest challenges right now. So let's talk a little bit about what's happening for renters in Fayetteville.
Yeah, I think number one is I would love to talk about rising rents outpacing wages. I know that from 2015 to 2025, the average rent increased from approximately $750 to $1,600 per month. We've heard that from Circle leaders in our program, and I know that there's probably some other data that we could include here too.
Yeah, I mean, I think from the city's perspective, when I think about the housing crisis, it's obviously not something that happened overnight. Chronic underproduction definitely plays a role in that, but it's really a multi-decade problem. So it's going to take, I think, some creativity, some innovation to think about how we can, attack it from all levels. I think in Fayetteville in particular, when we think about some of the data that we've been looking at, there are sort of like three major trends that I always like to tell people to kind of orient them towards our housing challenges in particular. Obviously, I think it's no surprise to anybody that, being in a university town, our student population is kind of a unique category of residents that we have to think about in terms of housing needs and kind of how Where they end up, can really either, it can put pressure on our housing market as a whole. Since 2019, the student population at the university has increased about 25%. That's obviously a really big jump in a couple of years. So, thinking about sort of what that looks like in terms of development patterns is something that we've got to keep an eye on. And I think something that, our planning team is definitely tracking kind of over time. They look at, not only general sort of multifamily production for housing, but also student-specific housing too. So we've been keeping tabs on that as some of our annual housing assessment work. Kind of a second area that I always like to flag for people is really, obviously, this, I think, more recent trend of growing cost burden levels. So approximately 42% of our households, so that's almost 18,000 households in total, are housing cost burdened. And so when I say housing cost burden, that just means, they're spending 30% or more of their annual income on housing cost. Obviously, that's a significant strain in a budget. Housing is typically the largest item for most people in their monthly budget. So that's something that we definitely think about, not only in terms of housing cost burdens, but I think just overall sort of economic well-being. It's really important to monitor.
And that cost burden term is something that I've definitely been hearing more and more in the last few years. I hadn't heard that previously, but it just feels like more and more households are feeling that strain. But like you said, that specific description, the definition of cost burden is that spending more than 30% of your income on housing.
Absolutely. And, I think another trend that we've been watching is that our median household income is just really not keeping pace with median home values and with rents. So we're seeing something like between, 2000 and 2023, which is sort of like the latest data point that we have. The average or sort of median rent cost rather has increased 78%, while, median household income has only gone up a couple $1,000.
Yeah, that's shocking.
Yeah.
When you hear it like that, I feel like that's
very stark.
Yeah.
So we really have to think about, not only just, we need more housing sort of in overall, but I think really like what pockets of housing we need to hit different sort of categories of households, meet them where they are in terms of what they can afford to pay on a monthly basis.
Yeah, and I think all these stats really, I think it causes a lot of stress just hearing them, but it's also putting real stress on families and households.
Absolutely.
And Anna, can you share some of the stuff that we ended up talking about last year at our home event?
Yeah, I think that, again, it really does. It puts a lot of strain and stress and squeeze on families who are trying their best. I think, we shared a story about one renter who really showed how specifically out of state buyers can come in and just continuously raise a rent. There's really no regard for the community and the community growth. So sort of that lack of care for how the community grows. I think we see the lack of renters protections also in some of the stories that were shared last year. That is something that, if you want to talk a little bit more about the specifics for what renters protections or the lack of renters protections in Arkansas looks like, love to have you jump in.
Yeah, so one of the hard things about being a renter in the state of Arkansas is that we have very little protections for our renters. In fact, we're known as the worst state in the country for renters because of these lack of protections. And there's been some different legislation that's been filed and to try to create more protection, but it continues to be kind of skinny down to where it doesn't have a huge impact. Up until just a few years ago, we didn't even have minimum habitability standards, which is essentially saying that the housing, the place of residence has to meet at least some bare minimum to actually be considered safe to live.
Yeah, and I'm going to jump in and just say what those things are. Essentially, we have to have running hot, cold drinking water, working electricity and a functioning HVAC system, a sanitary sewer system, and a functioning roof. And that's just, the very basics. And essentially then what we don't have is...
Yeah, so that is what bare minimum habitability is at this point. And what we don't have, they didn't approve things like having a working smoke alarm and carbon monoxide. And there's not things to protect renters if they get to a place to live and they don't maintain the habitability. So right now we don't have this warranty of habitability, which, any kind of warranty is like, if something breaks, if it stops working in a span of time where it should still be good, you can get your money back, or you can, get a replacement. And that's what renters don't have when it comes to their housing. The, HVAC may have been working when they moved in, but if it breaks, they have no power and protection to be able to get the landlord to fix that. And so that puts a lot of renters in vulnerable places where their living conditions are not very good. And also, you mentioned, we have a lot of out-of-state developers. And so for people that don't live in this community, I think this is one of the most frustrating parts for me. They don't live here. They're not tied in to, the community of Fayetteville and what it means to be a resident here. They're only held to a minimum standard of what they have to provide for our community.
Yeah. And I'm going to jump in just to say really quick that while the landlord must provide those things in the beginning, what we also know, Marley, right, is that we have a really low rate. What's the vacancy rate? Yes, it's a really low vacancy rate. And so whether or not it has those things, when you're 10 people in line, you're probably going to take a place, because
that's all you can get.
It's all you can get. So it's like, you really can't be picky if you're going to go in there and be like, what, actually, this is supposed to have, this, then guess what? You're probably not going to get be the person chosen for the apartment. And so I think that's where things really begin to get conflated. And the city, to my knowledge, it really is pretty limited in what you're able to do, although I know you've taken some steps.
Yeah, I think, cities definitely have to be creative in the housing space. So a big factor that kind of influences our housing policy production at the local level is something called preemption. So that happens when a higher level of government limits what a lower level of government can do in terms of regulating housing or land use more generally. So Arkansas state law, they can restrict cities like Fayetteville from passing certain housing rules. So things like that are commonly brought up, like rent controls. I think those are common things that people think of as sort of common sense, things about density requirements or, limiting kind of the cost of a rental fee. Those are things that sound good in theory, but just like don't work within our sort of legal environment in Arkansas specifically. When I think about kind of the workaround for that, I think we do have some options of ways we can kind of encourage the same outcomes, but just sort of like with a different tool. So you'll hear a lot of people kind of talk about a carrot or a stick to kind of get a desired outcome. So in terms of thinking about kind of, quality of housing, the city has passed or uses rather the International Property Maintenance Code. So that's something to kind of encourage, proper upkeep of housing stock. And then also one area I know that we've been talking about a lot sort of internally as kind of a private sector solution is really thinking about how good fair lease terms can kind of be used to create better relationships between tenants and landlords, and really just sort of making things clear up front so people know what they're getting into and don't feel trapped in a situation where they don't feel like it makes sense for them to stay there, or they feel unsafe or something like that.
Yeah, I think that's such a great point, is that we really want to see improved relationships between renters and landlords, and for people in our community to not feel like they're being pitted against each other. I think that's possible with or without legislation. One of the benefits of this CoCreate event is that we're going to be bringing people together that have a lot of different housing experiences in Fayetteville and across Northwest Arkansas. So we're going to have renters and landlords and homeowners and realtors, developers in the room. And so they're going to get to hear from each other and like, what do these things actually mean for someone's real lived experience? And, in our housing event last year, just one example that really stuck out to me that we talked about a lot was, in Arkansas law, a landlord can ask someone to leave for no reasons, like no specific reasons, that with just 30 days notice, and reading that on a piece of paper, like, okay, that's a month, like maybe that's makes sense. But when you start talking to people who have lived in these homes for a long period of time, have always, paid their rent, and then suddenly they're forced to uproot in, 30 days, that's a huge burden that is placed on a family. And then not to mention like, where are you supposed to go? Yeah. And so we see when there's instability in housing for our renters, and when there's not other options for them, it does have those ripple effects. Mm-hmm. So kids have to switch schools and workers have to change jobs. And we just see like some of the breakdown in our communities and our neighborhoods. And so we know renters in our community, they want to feel stable, they want to feel supported. We have some assistance for renters, some nonprofits, some churches and faith-based organizations, but it's definitely not near enough to support the renter population we do have. So, Marley, is there anything else from the city's perspective, things that the cities has taken, steps they've taken to address support for renters?
Yeah, one recent example from sort of late this spring, so we passed a rental fee disclosure ordinance. So kind of the starting point of that piece of local legislation was really around, someone had kind of come to the city and asking them to explore whether or not it was possible to cap rental fees. As I mentioned earlier, kind of around that preemption conversation, that's not something that's sort of legally permissible within the state, but we try to sort of tackle that particular problem from a different angle, which is really just, okay, if we can disclose fees at the front, so there's no sort of surprises at the front end, that can be kind of another way where we can sort of incrementally improve that experience for our residents. So one of the other things that kind of came out of that, whenever we had the draft ordinance language, we convened kind of a focus group of renters, landlords, and property managers to kind of just talk about, okay, like what concerns do you have about this as written? What are areas where you feel like you need more clarification? How can we make this sort of, I always like to say, easy to implement? Like we want it to be kind of painless for everybody to kind of make that change. And one of the things that was most requested was just having some sort of standardized disclosure form that the city produced. So that's something that we made available in English and in Spanish on our website. So we're hoping that that's something that, landlords across the city, if they need to, they obviously need to comply with it. So we might as well sort of make it easier for them to do so. And I think kind of the added bonus of that form too is that, if more people are using it, it's also something that's familiar from a renter perspective, makes it easier to compare decisions, especially whenever you're having to make those decisions in a really tight time frame. Just trying to make that experience a little bit less painful for renters too.
Yeah, I love that the city brought two groups together to really.
That don't always get brought together.
Yeah, exactly, and it's such a good starting point for even going into this work around CoCreate to show like this is what's possible when we're talking across these lines that often just divide us, so we just don't naturally bump into each other. That there's a lot of actually tangible solutions and action that can come from that.
Yeah, I think it's clear we're going to need a lot of different, partners and individuals across the city to kind of come at this issue in particular around renters. And one last thing I'll add about kind of recent city work has been really working on fostering a relationship with the Fayetteville Housing Authority. So they've recently undergone a leadership change and kind of a strategic visioning process to sort of figure out what they want to do moving forward. And I'm really excited that we're actually going to have their executive director on the workshop panel. So I think she's going to be able to share her kind of vision for how the housing authority can play a bigger role in this space, particularly moving forward.
Yeah. I know we're really excited just to see the housing authority start to build back to their full strength. There's so many different things that our city can access to support people and renters, and so that was a really exciting development. That if people aren't kind of in this space knowing what's happening with renters, they may have not really understood why that happened. But I think it's a really great step for our city.
Absolutely.
So our second focus area is expanding access to homeownership. Marley, the data show Fayetteville's home ownership rate lags behind both the region and the nation. What's behind that gap?
Right. So I think, anyone living in Fayetteville is not, a stranger to kind of the concept that our housing prices are rising much faster than our median household income. I think when I think about this question, I really think about it in terms of like three target kind of resident subpopulations that we're really thinking about at the city. So one, we have folks who are what you'd call income ready. So that means they're earning enough to be able to afford, a monthly mortgage payment, for a house that they can kind of get without assistance. But they might just need a little bit of help kind of with that initial savings to get into a home. So things like a down payment for the home, things like closing costs, all of the things that you need to pay for sort of from start to end whenever you start on your home buying journey. I think that's kind of one group, and I know we're excited about the potential opportunity to really make a dent in down payment assistance moving forward at the city. The second group, I think, is a group that sort of aspires to be that kind of income-ready group, but they're not quite there. They need a few, additional experiences, I think, to kind of get them to be ready to start that home buying process. So the first step is really kind of accessing things like credit counseling, knowing what their financial picture looks like, taking a look at their income to see, okay, does this make sense? If someone's already kind of in a position where they're, struggling to rent, sometimes making that transition to homeownership doesn't quite make sense in terms of being able to sustainably, keep up with homeownership. So that's kind of one group that I think we can really do a lot more in terms of providing sort of centralized resources for them to sort of feel ready to move on to that next step whenever it makes sense for them to do so.
And a lot of people in that group would fit the Alice.
Exactly.
Right?
Correct. And then I think kind of the last group that I think about, I think it's important to acknowledge that the housing that makes sense for you today might not be the housing that makes sense for you, 10, 20 years from now. So we've really got to think about how we transition people in and out of, different homes, in and out of whether it makes sense for them to rent or own over the course of their life. Homeownership is not always the best choice for some people. So making sure, I think that we really look at this from a housing choice lens. I think we, in particular, are seeing this with our senior population, sort of being stuck in homes that are really larger than what makes sense for them. But because of our housing market, it's just really challenging for them to find a space that's, continues to be affordable while downsizing. It's just they're having a harder time doing that. And then kind of in turn, that creates a bit of a crunch on, younger families who are looking to kind of size up their homes. So it's kind of a delicate balance.
Yeah, definitely. Anna, can you speak to some of just the lived experience of what does it mean when people can't go from renting to owning?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one, we just talked about sort of the rental landscape and how challenging that is specifically in Arkansas. So there's all of those challenges, but then let's say somebody is ready for home ownership or would like to. I think that when it's out of reach financially because of various reasons that we just talked about, I think that there's it stops you from being able to build generational wealth. And we know that in this country that has historically been a way that families have been able to build wealth throughout generations. And so I think it also destabilizes families feeling like they're working and where is it ever going to get, because there isn't anything that's like to essentially to show for it that they're going to be able to pass on in order to guarantee stability. And so I think that there is even long term in the neighborhoods beyond the families. We have, when there's lack of renters protections, lack of ability to buy. We see a lot of turnover in communities and neighborhoods, and that takes away from the way that a city is able to thrive, the way that a community is able to grow together. And yeah, I think that we see the Alice population, specifically you and I every day in our work, really working, and unable to get out of the sort of cycle of just meeting basic needs and often not even being able to do that successfully from month to month. So I think really putting home ownership in the paths for people is something that would be stabilizing for not only the families, but for our communities overall.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm really excited for this CoCreate event. We're going to have expert panelists speaking about all of these 3 focus areas. And for this area in particular, we're going to have one of our circle leaders on the panel who actually just purchased her first home. And so we're going to get to hear, what is that home buying process? What did it look like for her? What community resources did she access to be able to navigate that process well? It's been cool to just hear her stories about, we talk a lot about social capital in circles. And so the people that connected her and helped her understand if this was a good decision or not, as well as some of the nonprofits she connected with. So I'm excited that we'll get to hear from her. Okay, Marley, can you talk about some of the things that the city is doing and can do around creating more pathways to sustainable ownership?
Absolutely. So, I know I've kind of touched on the importance of the role that I think the city can play in terms of being kind of a one-stop shop for information about programs that are available. The state has several programs that can support people who are interested in being first-time home buyers. So I think that's sort of one piece of the puzzle, is just making people aware of the resources that already exist. Another really important partner in that work is the lending community more generally. Mm-hmm. I was talking with a mortgage lender just the other day who was telling me that they offer sort of a private program that, they set aside sort of a certain amount of money every year to give some additional assistance to people to help them get into homes for the first time. And so that's not even a state level program that exists. That's just something that this bank has decided to do.
And people
so
may not be aware that.
I didn't even.
Yeah.
So, I think making sure that we're doing a better job of kind of highlighting all the type of work that's going on, not just sort of from the government, but also from the private sector as well, is a really big piece of that puzzle.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's so many opportunities in this focus area of different members of our community, different people with different professions that have a level of expertise that isn't always brought into the same space as the Alice population or someone who's wanting to be is working to be a first-time homeowner. It's a lot of this is like getting people to dialogue and become more aware of what is possible in this community.
And I think another kind of subcategory that we're thinking about needing to partner with more is that, housing, and I think homeownership can be a really valuable sort of talent recruitment and retention tool. So I think we're seeing calls within the region to really work with like major employers to think about how we can partner with them, be that through, housing development or sort of subsidization of housing, to really make sure that, their workers can afford to live here, because we want them to be able to, have long and fulfilling careers here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when you say that, that reminds me of the fact that, I've heard in the region that recruiting teachers has been really challenging because they haven't been able to find somewhere to live. So I think that, like you're saying, it's a recruitment tool, even to just keep our communities going. Obviously, we want good teachers. We want them to be able to have safe and affordable housing.
And we want people that work in Fayetteville and that want to live in Fayetteville to be able to be here and be here long term. So that's the future that we're going to be working towards with this second focus area. So now our third and final focus area is the creative use of existing spaces. I'm excited about this one. Marley, can you paint a picture of what that means in Fayetteville?
Right. So I think, when we talk about sort of like planning work, both in the short term and long term, kind of one of the key phrases that comes up a lot is really how land and property can be used to sort of its best and highest use, right? So kind of the worst case scenario is when we know we have, parcels that have never been developed that would be like really great prime location, close to amenities, close to schools, things like that don't have housing on them. Really thinking about how we can sort of use areas to the best of their ability, but also thinking about, I think, ways to reuse spaces that have been used in one way that made sense for, several decades, but aren't really making sense for our community now in its current moment. So I think the exciting thing about, being in a city is that you see it change over time, and that different spaces can sort of require, and offer different types of uses to be most beneficial for the community.
Yeah. One of the things I heard you mention earlier was we have, a older population that maybe is empty nesters now that because of things related to home accessibility are maybe not able to move or to downsize like they maybe would have in the past or want to. And so they have a lot of empty bedrooms, which is, an interesting thing given that we also have a high student population here. And so one of the things we've been talking a lot about in preparation for this particular focus area is, the overlap of those empty nester bedrooms with students. And there's, places across the country that have really brought those two populations together. And it is a creative use of an existing space, especially when students are trying to find affordable housing. And they often are renting by the bedroom anyway. And what I love about that one is just the community that it builds and really strengthens not just the housing sector, but the social and community aspect.
Yeah, I think I love it because it's mutually beneficial. We hear a loneliness epidemic, and when you can, just help someone else and then have company, and then it's a win-win situation. So I love a win-win situation.
Yeah. Yeah, and these are the kind of ideas that I hope will surface in this CoCreate, that will, that doesn't require like a whole lot of, funding or, expertise on I have to know how to build a home. That's obviously really important, and we don't minimize that in any way, but there are things that everyday people in our community could do to address some of these housing issues and come up with real solutions. So another thing that comes up fairly often when we're talking about using existing spaces is something around ADUs. Can you talk about what an ADU is and what that could look like?
Yeah, I think it's a really exciting use of an existing space. Usually they would go in someone's backyard, which if you have a backyard, you then have an existing space that you could use. So ADU stands for accessory dwelling unit. And this past year during the legislative session, a bill was passed that allows ADUs. Marley, I'm going to have you take this.
Absolutely. So House Bill 1503, essentially kind of the main point of it is that it allows for the construction of ADUs on any lot that is zoned for single family homes. So that means you don't have to kind of go through the hoops of getting that approved. So I think it's really important and exciting that, that bill got bipartisan support in our state legislature. We'll also have Representative Clowney, who is one of the bill's sponsors on our workshop panel. So we're excited to kind of dig into the details of how that bill came to be. I think from the city's perspective, we've allowed, I think we were, sort of a leader in sort of the ADU space in terms of incorporating that within our development code over the past several years. But I think after the passage of this bill, we've also tried to make a few additional tweaks to just make constructing ADUs a little bit easier. So one of those things in particular is change we've recently made is changing what counts as the front of a property. So traditionally that's just sort of like public streets, but we've changed that recently to include alleys, trails, public parks. So really just trying to make it a little bit more feasible about where an ADU can go in terms of other requirements that are outside of just whether or not it's allowed in general.
Yeah, so these are really interesting use of existing spaces like a backyard. Some of the other panelists that we're going to have at this event are going to speak to other ways that our communities creatively using space. I'm really excited to hear from an organization that's working on a community land trust. Anna's been talking about this for years now. So we're excited to hear more about that and how that could also, boost more opportunities for homeownership. And then one of the really interesting things that's happening is around the existing spaces that faith-based organizations and churches have. It's a movement that we're seeing even outside of this area of churches saying, like, I have this existing land, what could we do with it? And so an organization will be coming to speak on that and how they're partnering with faith-based organizations.
Yeah, which I love the acronym that they're using for that, which is YIGBY, which stands for Yes in God's Backyard, which is in theory, just a counter to NIMBY, which is not in my backyard. So I think that it's a really interesting thing to see start taking root.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I do hope this CoCreate is a way to break down some of that NIMBYism, as people refer to it, of like, I don't want this near me. But when we're talking as a community, when we're hearing the challenges and struggles and ideas of other people, maybe, thinking about ADUs, maybe thinking about, this mixed use development, for example, could actually really benefit our community. I think hopefully will be a lot more openness to some of these things that could really benefit our community as we continue to grow. We're not stopping the growth anytime soon. Okay. Is anything else that we want to mention around creative use of existing spaces?
I mean, I can mention some of the benefits that I think are potentially there, which, if there's an existing lot and you're not having to buy it right, automatically that brings the affordability down. So if land is donated, if it's your backyard, obviously that's a cost that's getting cut. Sometimes, let's say Marley mentioned that maybe there is a building that's been used in one way, but we could use it in another way. Sometimes reusing infrastructure that's already there, A, it avoids sprawl, B, there might be, yes, there's already the sidewalks, there's already the plumbing going to it. So this, that cuts down on cost as well. And then revitalization as well. Communities, instead of like trying to continuously go out. First of all, no one likes traffic. So if we can for long commutes. And then, if we can create communities that are have hubs, and instead of continuously creating new ones, just revitalize and continue to build on ones that exist, I think is really wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that point about kind of intentional growth management, sometimes we think about that being, uniquely sort of like a planning concept of, zoning and all of these different things about how stuff gets built. But I think it's also important to kind of like see it as a call to action for different people, just your everyday resident, to kind of see what role they can play in intentional growth management. So one example that I always love to talk about is we have something called the Hearth program. in Fayetteville, and it provides permanent supportive housing to people who are formerly homeless. And I think the great thing about that program is that, it takes it kind of provides a benefit for landlords if they participate in that. Maybe they have kind of like an extra unit or an ADU or something that they've kind of had a hassle trying to rent it out in the past. Just not being able, not knowing sort of if rent's going to be collected and things like that have created some uncertainty that have made it not worth their while, to do it. But this program sort of provides a guarantee of you'll always get paid through this program. So like this is sort of like the best case scenario in terms of getting a tenant from a landlord's perspective. So it's kind of a win-win scenario for the person that wants to be able to use that space in a way that's productive for them, but is also providing much needed supportive housing for our residents.
Win-win. Win-win.
Another win-win.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that came to mind when you were talking about, when we're talking about community land trusts, people, we have land trusts when it comes to preserving land for the environment, for conservation. But these are new opportunities, I think, as people try to figure out what to do with land that they're not using, or as they're trying to figure out what to do with homes as the older generation passes away. Like, this is a really cool legacy that I think people could live or rethink how they're thinking about their legacy for our city. And so I'm just excited about what our community is going to come up with around this area, because I think empty spaces are really opportunities, and we just need to unlock their potential. So here's the vision statement for this third focus area. Fayetteville unlocks the potential of existing spaces, turning underutilized housing and land into vibrant, affordable homes that strengthen our neighborhood. So, okay, we've walked through the 3 focus areas that will shape this CoCreate: stabilizing and supporting renters, expanding access to homeownership, and creatively using existing spaces. I hope that people will see that building homes is important, but it's not the only way that we can begin to address this housing crisis. So each of these areas that we talked about has a vision for the future that we want to build together. And I think this is really what makes CoCreate different. We're not just trying to be experts or officials debating solutions. We're not just community members coming and giving public comment to city council, but this is about community members, people with the lived experience, everyone who's living here in the community together, working side by side with city leaders, nonprofits, and neighbors to design ideas that can really move the needle. So when we gather at this event, the goal isn't that we're just going to talk. It's really we're going to understand from each other's perspective and from the perspective of these experts in our community. Then we're going to reimagine, and then we're going to take action, and moving from challenges to solutions that can really take root here in Fayetteville. And so by the end of this event, we're going to have real ideas and pitches that could become the next steps for our city. And that's not even just hypothetical. Like, there's a second part to the grant that the city is part of that is for implementation. So we need these ideas so that we can go implement them.
Yeah, no, and I'm so excited to see everyone that comes. I'm excited that there will be renters, there will be homeowners, there will be people new to the city, there'll be people who have, great grandchildren who live in this city who have been here for generations. I think that everyone's perspective matters, and in fact, it's crucial. For this to be a success, we need a diverse lived experiences, and we need them to all come together and be able to see where each person's story and experience is coming from. And from that is where these pitches, I hope, will be born with these ideas. So I'm really excited to see what comes out.
Yeah, and from the city's perspective, I think this is exactly the kind of new types of collaboration that we're interested in doing. Mayor Ron has really given us a directive to sort of leave no stone unturned and looking for new and innovative ideas that we can use to, really tackle our housing challenges together. I think none of us are kind of under the impression that government alone can solve any issue. Nevertheless, one as complex as housing. So I think we're really excited about the opportunity, to have, kind of government, the private sector, nonprofits, and, actual individuals really driving kind of our next steps for housing change.
Yes, definitely. And there is a pitch at the end.
Yes.
So people get to put together their ideas, and we're going to have prizes that are for the winning groups. And so it's going to be fun. It's going to be exciting. So if you're listening, we hope that you'll join us and that you come ready to dream and to dig into the challenges, build solutions with your neighbors. This is about shaping the future of Fayetteville together. So our event, CoCreate, the Future of Fayetteville, is going to be Friday, September 5th from 6 to 8 is the panelist part. And then the next day, Saturday, September 6th from 10 to 3, that's where you'll come back and go through this CoCreate process to understand, reimagine, and then come up with your pitches. So we invite you to come to that. We're really excited about it. And we thank you for joining this conversation and hope to see you there.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.